Heavy metal historians often credit the 90s, the mid 90s, as a time of the new wave of American heavy metal. But tonight I'm going to make a counter argument that 1983 was the greatest year in the history of American heavy metal. And I'm also going to point out that some of the biggest acts in the history of heavy metal got their start right here in 1983. That this is the greatest bumper crop of heavy metal bands to ever be established. Who are those bands? What was their influence? And who's going to take home the prize for Rookie of the Year? Find out next. Welcome, metal enthusiasts, to another episode of The Metal Dude Abides. If you're familiar with this show, we've been doing a kind of a special on what we call Fixing the Grammys. And we go through the Grammy categories and hand out awards if heavy metal were being treated fairly. Because in my humble opinion, the Grammys have always ignored heavy metal, or when they finally started to recognize them, often missed the mark. Well, one of the categories that the Grammys often has given out in the entirety of this my lifetime has been Newcomer of the Year. And with a couple of exceptions, like Led Zeppelin, for instance, they have never really acknowledged heavy metal. So on this channel, we talk about the best newcomer to heavy metal every year. And if you're familiar, you'll know that a lot of times I will just say, here's the best newcomer of the year. There's one band out there that just stands above the rest, or maybe there's two or three, but rarely, in fact, I don't think it's happened on the show yet, where we've had 5 nominees of best heavy metal newcomer. But this year, 1983, I've never seen a year quite like it. There are so many huge bands that are going to come out in 1983. Not only do I have 5 very good nominees for heavy metal, I'm going to branch out and do 5 for hard rock. And not only that, I'm going to have at least 10 honorable mentions. That's right, ladies and gentlemen. If you are keeping score at home, there are at least 20 notable heavy metal hard rock bands that come out in 1983, and many of them American. Again, I will say that this is the absolute best year in the history of heavy metal in America. I have a feeling that after the new wave of British heavy metal happened in 1980, people were looking around, looking for the next big band, and naturally, many bands were being influenced by that music. So people started looking and perusing through America, and they start finding band after band after band. So we're going to talk about all of these bands. We're going to start with the honorable mentions, and then, like I said, we're going to go through the top 5 hard rock newcomers and the top 5 metal newcomers to announce the winner. If you like pro football, let me just say that in 1983, ironically enough, they had one of the greatest drafts in the history of the NFL. And in fact, it's called the year of the quarterback because the NFL produced 3 Hall of Fame quarterbacks: John Elway, Dan Marino, and Jim Kelly. And that doesn't even talk about all the other great stars that came out in that draft. So in honor of that, tonight we're going to talk about the greatest draft in the history of heavy metal. So let's start with honorable mention. As we go through the honorable mention, I'm going to go through them in alphabetical order. So this is not a ranking at this point in time. And some of these bands are going to be on this list because they went on to great commercial success. Or some may be groundbreaking bands that started a genre, etc. But sometimes these people are on this list simply because they had some of the greatest musicians pass through their band, and that's the case with our first honorable mention. I'm going to do a dual one here the bands Alcatraz and Steeler. Before I even say it, you probably know these bands are on this list because they both had a young Swedish guitarist by the name of Yngwie Malmsteen debut here. Now, the first album that comes out is Steeler. This was a band brought out by the legendary singer Ron Keel, and they introduced the world to Yngwie Malmsteen. Now, Yngwie Malmsteen had very different ideas of where he wanted to go musically, and Ron Keel had a much more commercial sound. So after one pretty decent album, they disbanded. And Yngwie Malmsteen joins up with ex-Rainbow singer Graham Bonnet. Now, legend has it that this is also at the same time the legendary drummer Clive Burr has been fired from Iron Maiden. And he is set to join the band as well until he realizes Graham Bonnet now lives in the United States, and this band would be located in the States, not in England. And Clive Burr, as you know, way back in the day, really not big on traveling too far away from England, so he bows out. Yngwie is very disappointed when he finds out Clive Burr's not going to be part of the band, but they hang together for a little bit. But Graham Bonnet and Yngwie Malmsteen, you talk about oil and water. Apparently, the last straw was a bit of an altercation between Graham Bonnet and Yngwie Malmsteen that apparently Graham Bonnet got so angry with Yngwie that he hit him with his mic stand right there while they were performing live. Needless to say, Alcatraz didn't last much longer than Steeler did. Yngwie Malmsteen we're going to be talking a lot about as he goes on to fame and fortune as a solo act. But right here in 1983, you can catch the early stages of Yngwie's career with the band Steeler and their self-titled album, and Alcatraz with their album No Parole for Rock and Roll. Two pretty good albums, and if you're a fan of Yngwie Malmsteen, a must listen. The second honorable mention is a band that is on this list because they were going to go on to fame and fortune. The band, of course, is named Europe, and they, of course, are the artists that put out one of the most well-recognized songs of all time, The Final Countdown. And if you're a wrestling fan, you know that this has been Bryan Danielson's music when he was on the Indies, and then recently when he was with AEW. So, you know, I recently went to an AEW event. In fact, I'm wearing their colors right now, where there was a match called Anarchy in the Arena, this, that, or the other. Daniel Bryan's part of this. And all of a sudden, the Final Countdown hits. We're in Las Vegas, Nevada, and the place just goes crazy. And I'm thinking, my goodness, this song is, 40 years old, and people still love Final Countdown. But Europe gets their start, their very first album, right here in 1983. And it's pretty good. One of the better tracks on there is a song called The King Will Return. So if you're a big fan of Europe and have heard the Final Countdown, maybe go back a couple of albums to their beginning. Maybe a little raw, maybe a little less polished, but still really good music. Very good melodic hard rock. The very first of the program, we talked about how this 1983 was one of the greatest years in the history of American heavy metal, and here's a band to start that role with, Armored Saint. One of my all-time favorite bands right here, ladies and gentlemen. John Bush and Company really set the world on fire with a series of really good albums in the early 80s. Unfortunately, and you're going to hear this a lot, especially when you're talking about young bands in the 80s, record company deals and record company shenanigans really held this band back. It's hard to believe now with the internet and the way the music industry is now, but the entire music industry was run by the big labels. And if you were a band that got crosswise with your label, or you got a poor label that didn't support you, it usually meant your doom. And Armored Saint really never they got off to a really rough start because of lack of record company support. And then just as it seemed like they were getting going and starting to get a name for themselves, their lead guitarist tragically passes away from cancer. It just wasn't meant to be. Armored Saint should have been huge. They came out at the same time with Metallica. It's the famous story that after Kill 'Em All, James Hetfield wanted to bring in a lead singer for Metallica. They approached John Bush about leaving Armored Saint to be part of Metallica. If Metallica thinks you're talented enough to be the face of the band, you know you're talented. So anyway, Armored Saint never really worked out. John Bush ended up being part of the Big Four, though, a few years down the road as he comes in and becomes the lead singer for the band Anthrax for a few albums. So he worked his way to that Big Four one way or the other. But again, this is one of those big heavy metal bands that comes out of America. We're going to talk about a bunch of them, but none will be better than one of my faves, Armored Saint. Our next honorable mention is another band that went on to huge commercial success just a few years down the road. The name of that band is Great White. Gotta love a band named after a great white shark. Funny thing is, Great White almost never happened because when they first got together in the late 70s, Jack Russell got himself in trouble with the law and got sentenced to prison for 8 years. Well, luckily for the music world, he got early parole. Maybe that should have been the name of the band, because without that early parole, there would have been no Great White. But after just a few years, he was released from prison, and they put out this EP, Out of the Night. And while it's not the style of music that you probably know and love from them, when they make it big, they have a very bluesy sound. This is much more raw, much more heavy, but I gotta say, I dig this EP a lot. If you're familiar with their more successful work, do yourself a favor, go back a couple of years, check out this EP in particular. Very heavy, very raw, but very, very good. If they had put out a full album here, I think they would have probably snuck in to our finals category. But as it is, they're one of the best honorable mentions on the list. Our next honorable mention is a supergroup band of the early 80s, but one that didn't ever really get the recognition I thought they would get. The band's name was HSAS, and it stood for the last name of the 4 members of the band. Now, the 2 most famous members of the band you've probably heard of, lead singer Sammy Hagar, right in the midst of a very good solo run, Neil Schon, who, of course, was the lead guitarist of one of the biggest bands in the world, Journey, and Kenny Aronson and Michael Shreve. Now, I have to admit, don't know much about those two, but also really good musicians. Based in the San Francisco area, they threw this band together. Neil Schon, I think, wanted to get a little heavier. Sammy Hagar and Neil Schon were friends, so they decided to put this collaboration together. Supergroups back in this day were not all that common. Most people stuck to the band that they were in. You didn't get a lot of side projects, so this was fairly unique. Another thing that made this unique is they made one album, but I don't know that I've ever really seen this done before. They write all this material and they do a concert, and then they take the concert footage and tone down all the audience and everything and turn it into a studio album. Kind of an original thing. It is really good, and you see the talent of Neil Schon and Sammy Hagar in the band, because this is not done in the studio. This is done in a live performance, and this band had only played together for a little bit of time. Pretty amazing stuff. Lots of good tracks on here. A highlight for me, I love the Procol Harum cover, Whiter Shade of Pale. They do that really fantastic here. There are just a few timeless songs that, they get covered a million times and you love it every time. The nitpicky thing I'll say about this, and maybe the reason it doesn't make the finals, is many years later, I bought this album. I played it to death. And, down the road, when they put out the CD version, they actually put out all the songs from the concert and put them into the album. And there's a song, the bonus tracks are actually, I was very curious as I was listening to these bonus tracks. I was like, why didn't these songs make the album? Because there's actually a couple of really good songs, in particular, Moving In for the Kill. How did that not make the album? I don't know. It is a fantastic, hard rockin' song that really displays both Sammy Hagar and Neil Schoen's absolute prowess here. But so if you bought the album way back in the day like I did, and you have never picked up the CD, go out and get the CD and listen for the bonus tracks, because I think there's like 4 or 5 bonus tracks on here, and at least 2 or 3 of them, in my humble opinion, should have been on the original album. They're that good. And once again, just astonished at how this band just comes together, plays in front of a live audience, and sounds this good. This is one of those little gems from the 80s that you may not have heard of. Go check it out. HSAS. Broken record alert. We've already talked about this a couple times, where you see a band starting off in 1983 with kind of humble beginnings and then has a lot more commercial success 2 or 3 years down the road. Our next honorable mention artist also fits in that category. Lita Ford and her debut album, Out for Blood. Lita Ford doesn't really get that commercial success right off the bat. She has just come out from the all-girl band The Runaways with a very famous person that also came out of The Runaways, Joan Jett. Joan Jett just had an amazing hit, I Love Rock and Roll, Crimson and Clover. Joan Jett was a legit superstar. So probably people were like, well, who else from The Runaways can we get? And they signed Lita Ford to a heavy metal contract. Out for Blood is a lot more raw, a lot more heavy, and really focuses on Lita Ford's guitar playing. I actually dig this a lot more than her big heyday a few years down the road. You see, a few years down the road, she hasn't had a lot of commercial success. Knock, knock, knock. Here comes Sharon Osbourne. They kind of commercial her sound up a little bit, so it's a little smoother, a little more palatable for the masses. Of course, she does the famous duet with Sharon's husband, Ozzy Osbourne, Close My Eyes Forever, and becomes a pretty big hit. But all of that to say, if you want to hear Lita Ford really shredding on the guitar, really gritty, really bluesy, come all the way back to 1983, and Out for Blood is an absolute banger. We're going to take a little bit of a break from this string of American bands to go completely off-road here and talk about Denmark, because they're going to put out 2 of the most influential bands in heavy metal history. I'm speaking, of course, of probably the most famous of the 2, Merciful Fate, led by the infamous King Diamond, and Pretty Maids, a band that has been around, again, since 1983, was in the music business, for like 4 decades, never really achieved that commercial success, but had a good cult following that followed them around for decades. So, yes, there's a ton of great American music, but this is really, I think, the first time we really see the Danish bands come into play, and they get 2 good ones right off the bat. Again, neither one of them are household names, but in particular, Merciful Fate, one of the most influential bands of all time. The next honorable mention is the best kept secret in the history of heavy metal, because the band wants to keep this the best kept secret in the history of heavy metal. Pantera with their album Metal Magic. Now, this is pre-Phil, but there is a singer on this album by the name of Terry Glaze that's really good. But let's face it, the highlight, the reason you come to see this album, the Abbott brothers are sensational. Dimebag is just shredding on this album. I really like the guitars on here, but not to be undone. His brother is just bashing the drums in the background. Drums are good. Guitars are great. This vocalist he's no Phil Anselmo, but he's pretty damn good. He holds his own. This band sounds great, except, their songwriting's, let's just say, a little bit on the immature side. Very much a hair metal band. If you ask me, and you'd have to ask the band if this was the case, but really sounds like they were influenced by Kiss, especially that kind of Love Gun era of Kiss. That's what it sounds to me like. Very different. Very, very hair metally compared to the Pantera we're going to see in a few years down the road, where they're going to come out with a whole new sound and a toughness that you don't see quite yet on this album. So Pantera kind of, what? Hair metal? Us? Never. But we've got the video to prove it, folks. In 1983, Pantera with their debut album, Metal Magic. Another band that is going to be launched into superstardom just a few years later is a band by the name of Rat. You probably heard of them because 1 year later, their Out of the Cellar album is going to go, I'm sure, platinum times something. This band was huge. When you talk about, for lack of a better term, the glam metal scene or the hair metal scene or whatever that LA scene was, when you start talking about the big bands that came out of there, sure, there's Motley Crue that kind of led the way, but there's a few bands that fell right in line as some of the biggest acts of that generation and that genre. One of those that's synonymous with it is this band right here, Rat. They were on the very first Metal Massacre album with a song, Tell the World, that also appears right here on this EP. And if you're familiar with their mega selling hit, Out of the Cellar, they have the song Back for More. It's a little bit of a different version, but kind of interesting that it's on this album. Although Round and Round was the big hit off of Out of the Cellar, in my humble opinion, Back for More, a much better song. One of my favorite Rat songs of all time. Again, it is here. You see the potential. I'm always amazed. We talk about Armored Saint, right? Why didn't they make it big? Record label, right? Why did Rat make it big? Well, yeah, they were talented, but they really got pushed by the record company. They got on the MTV. They had a big, slick video production. They had great production on their albums, and they took advantage of that situation and just went skyrocketing into the stratosphere. Again, one of the bigger bands to come out of this entire genre, Rat. Stephen Pearcy and the gang, and they start off with a very good EP. Another big influential American band that comes out in 1983, Suicidal Tendencies. Hard to believe that they have been around since 1983. One, again, of the most influential bands, maybe. But I have to say, Suicidal Tendencies, to me, has one of the most unique sounds in the history of heavy metal. I don't hear anybody that sounds like Suicidal Tendencies. Their first big hit, if you will, is on this album, Institutionalized. And it's really, again, that unique suicidal tendency of kind of the spoken word. Through most of that song, he's just talking, he's just dialoguing while the band's playing in the background. Just fascinating stuff. I really like Suicidal Tendencies. They have put together, again, a string of albums, a career that spans, as far as I know, still going to today, 40 plus years, and one of the most unique American heavy metal bands of all time. One last honorable mention before we get to the finalists in the two categories. We have talked a lot about all the big American bands that have showed up on the shores, but the new wave of British heavy metal, while it's in its very last stages, puts out two more great bands. Those bands, Grim Reaper and Tokyo Blade. Grim Reaper, one of the most legendary singers of all time, Steve Grimmett. They go on to put out 1, 2, 3 of the best albums you're ever going to hear. They start off with the See You in Hell, Fear No Evil, and, maybe my favorite of the three, Rock You to Hell. Unfortunately, they don't break it big because, once again, repeat after me, record label interference. They kind of got crossways. There's a big gap in time between Fear No Evil and Rock You to Hell, and they kind of lose momentum. There's some other types of music that are coming up, we're going to talk about in a minute, that kind of took their sound and kind of made it seem a little outdated. But man, you talk about a fantastic vocalist, and really a band that was on the verge. I always thought they were just on the verge of breaking big. Their first album, again, See You in Hell, the title track gets played on MTV almost nonstop, really gets that following going. They just were never able to follow up with that because, again, record label trouble. But if for some reason you missed them, go back and check them out. 3 very good albums for you to listen to. The other band, Tokyo Blade, again, another new wave of British heavy metal band that is absolutely excellent. The band that I always compare them to is the Tigers of Pantang, a very similar style. I love Tigers of Pantang. I love Tokyo Blade. 2 bands that just never quite got over and were able to get that momentum to shoot into stardom like some of these other bands that we've talked about. We talk about record labels, but one of the other things that was going on, and you see it in the new wave of British heavy metal, and you see it right here, there was a lot of band instability where every 5 seconds they were changing out members. And the best example of this, right? Iron Maiden, legendary band. They went through it. The first 4 albums that Iron Maiden makes, it's a different lineup every album. Metallica was going through that, although most of that happened before they started on the label. I would say that Tokyo Blade had some issues that they just couldn't overcome because they were just kind of going through different members and whatnot. So a little bit of self-inflicted damage there. But again, and again, the new wave of British heavy metal was kind of starting to slow down. These are probably 2 of the last great bands that came out of that movement, but 2 really good ones. Again, go back. Grim Reaper and Tokyo Blade are bands worth a listen. You're probably thinking to yourself, all of these bands and none of them even made the top 10? Who are we missing? Well, we're missing some really great bands. We're going to break into those now because our first category is going to be Newcomer of the Year in the hard rock category. Our first nominee, Dokken, with Breaking the Chains. Really an unusual story here. Dokken, an LA band, actually puts out this particular album in Europe 1 year earlier. Very rare, I think. I can't think of another example of a band, an American band, that produces their first album overseas and then a year later releases it in America. Don Dokken was also kind of busy in '82, as there were some points where Klaus Meine was having some vocal surgeries and he was doing some recordings with the Scorpions, just in case. Luckily for us, Klaus Meine recovered, was able to record the album, and of course Don went on to record this album. We talked about earlier where you look at the royalty of the big hair movement of California. We talked about Motley Crue. We've talked about Rat. One of the others, like if there was a big 4, I think one of the others would be Dokken. They rhyme with rockin'. Very good band. excellent lead singer Don Dokken, unbelievable guitarist George Lynch, of course Jeff Bilson, Mick Brown, great band. One of the things, the standout track on this album to me, when I really started to realize, ooh, this Dokken band, this is going to be a good band. They do a live song on there, Paris is Burning, that really highlights George Lynch, and you start to go, who is this new guitar genius on the map? He is fantastic. This first Dokken album, very good. Our first nominee, Dokken, Breaking the Chains. Dokken, pretty good commercial successful band, but nothing like our next band, Quiet Riot, with their album Metal Health. I believe that this album was the first heavy metal album to go number one. Of course, they have the huge hit, the cover of Slade's Come On, Feel the Noise. We're also at the age where MTV, being very influential, they had a video for this, and MTV used to be fun and cool and really did some interesting things. So on Friday nights, they would have videos go up against one another to see who was the biggest video of the week. They'd go at it head to head. People would vote. And Come On, Feel the Noise was like they were just chugging along, winning week after week. People loved this album. It also, very similarly, I think this album was out quite a while before it caught on. One of those, we talked about this a little bit with Guns N' Roses' Appetite for Destruction, that it was out a while before it finally kicked in. A friend of mine gave me a copy of it, and I was like, oh, this is really good stuff. And, again, I was in a small town at that point, so maybe it was bigger than I thought, but I didn't hear anybody talking about Quiet Riot. And then all of a sudden, that's all you heard about was Quiet Riot. Our second nominee, Quiet Riot, with the album Metal Health. Our third nominee, Fastway, with their self-titled debut. Now you're thinking, Fastway, why would a band call their album Fastway? Well, glad you asked. Motorhead lead guitarist Fast Eddie Clarke had enough of Lemmy's nonsense, and he strikes out on his own. And it seemed like he was going to join forces with UFO's Pete Way. Pete Way, however, decided, nah, I think I'm going to sit this one out. But they'd already named the band, and so here you go. One of my favorite Fast Eddie guitar songs comes off this album, Say What You Will. It is an absolute killer riff that'll stick in your head for days. Our third nominee, Fastway. Our fourth nominee, Zebra, with their self-titled album. Zebra is one of those bands you hear about every 5-10 years that comes around the pike that says, this is the next Led Zeppelin. And truth be told, Zebra sounds a lot like Led Zeppelin. Very similar to the Robert Plant bluesy crooning. They have a couple of excellent songs on this album. Tell Me What You Want and Who's Behind the Door. Man, I loved this album so much. I was one of those who thought Zebra was going to be one of the biggest bands in the world. Unfortunately, they're kind of a one-hit, two-hit wonder. This first album really went over, but Zebra never really made it. Very similar to Kingdom Come. Kingdom Come was kind of the next band that came up, the next Led Zeppelin, and their first album was fantastic, and then they just kind of faded off. Same thing happens to Zebra. So you might have missed these guys. Go back, check them out. Be worth your time. And our fifth and final nominee comes from Sweden, one of the early Swedish heavy metal bands, 220 Volt, with their self-titled album. I don't understand why 220 Volt did not make it bigger than they were. They have an amazing sound. This is an amazing album. And it's not just this album. They have 2 or 3 albums in a row here that are very good. I don't know. Again, the 80s were a different time. I'm not sure if we were ready for a Swedish band, or maybe they just couldn't get over here to the States and get that exposure. As far as I know, they never put out any videos, that sort of thing. Probably didn't get a lot of record label love. But, one of those, I'm going to have to do a special about these undiscovered gems. And right at the top of that list would be 220 Volt. Broken Record Time. If you haven't heard 220 Volt, go check them out. They are an incredible band. Their songwriting kind of maybe is a little immature on this one. They're going to even get better than this album, in my opinion. But this album is still very, very good. And so it gets the last nominee for Best Hard Rock Album, Newcomer, 1983. And the winner is Dokken, Breaking the Chains. You might as well know now, spoiler alert, Dokken is one of my favorite bands to come out of that whole LA scene. I love Don Dokken's voice. I love George Lynch's guitars. George Lynch famously auditioned for Ozzy's band after Randy Rhoads' death. And quite frankly, with all due respect to J.K. Lee, I think Ozzy might have blown this one because there's not too many guitarists in the world that can hold a candle to George Lynch. Love Jeff Pilson. Mick Brown. The whole band is great. Jeff Pilson has been around several bands. One of the most sought-after bass players in the world. Really good band. They are going to go on. As much as I like Breaking the Chains, their next few albums are going to be absolute monsters. Again, a little bit of a spoiler alert. But let's move on to the best newcomer in the heavy metal category. Whenever you start talking about newcomers, sometimes you get someone who's well known in the industry starting up a new band. So let me give you a good for instance of this. In 1980, we had a dilemma on our hands because of Iron Maiden, a brand new band comes out, but Ozzy Osbourne just started his solo band, Blizzard of Oz. Yeah, Ozzy had been around a decade, but he'd never been a solo artist before, so he would also have been a newcomer. We have a very similar situation this year as Ronnie James Dio brings on his band, Dio. Our first nominee, Dio, and their unbelievable album, Holy Diver. I'm not going to talk a lot about Holy Diver here. It is one of my favorite albums of all time. Probably is going to be, spoiler alert, in the running for many awards for 1983. Just know that this is a tremendous album. Dio has had a long career, I believe, 14, 15 solo albums. Nothing ever topped this very first album. Ronnie James Dio goes out and gets a guitarist from the new wave of British heavy metal, Viv Campbell. I believe he was in the band Sweet Savage. What a perfect choice. He is sensational. He teams up, of course, with old Rainbow friend Jimmy Bain. And, of course, Vinny Appice follows him over for Sabbath for a whole new band that comes in as a newcomer here. Our first nominee, Dio, and their album, Holy Diver. However, much like Ozzy had to go up against Iron Maiden, Dio's got some stiff competition because the biggest heavy metal band on the planet just showed up. Metallica with their album, Kill 'Em All. This is, I can't do this album justice. Again, I'll probably do an entire episode focused just on this album. That's how much I love this album. It is a unique Metallica album because this is the only Metallica album that has many influences from Dave Mustaine. Remember, Dave Mustaine, the lead guitarist and singer for Megadeth, was in Metallica when most of this material was written. They boot Dave out of the band, but his influence in the songs and the the music is undeniable. Now, Metallica goes on to have a career without Dave Mustaine, and their next albums are going to sound remarkably different than this one. Dave Mustaine's going to go on and form Megadeth without Metallica, so Megadeth is going to sound different. This is the only, the Venn diagram, this is the only one with both the Metallica and Dave Mustaine influence, and it is close to my heart. I love this album. It's our second nominee. One more thing, and it was also almost famously called Metal Up Your Ass, but the record company went, no freaking way are we going to name an album Metal Up Your Ass. They even had an album cover with a hand coming up out of the toilet with a switchblade. The record company was like, we are not putting that in the Walmarts across America. Cliff Burton, their unbelievable bassist, infamously was upset with this decision and said, kill them all. Our second nominee, Metallica. Kill them all. You're probably thinking, all right, well, who could compete? We've got Dio, we've got Metallica. Well, our third nominee is another biggie, folks. Queensryche comes out with their self-entitled EP. Man, Queensryche caught the world's attention right away. And again, Metallica doesn't put out any videos till way at the end of their And Justice for All when they put out one. But Queensryche, even though it's just an EP and they're a brand new band, they had a video right off the bat, Queens of the Reich, and it just grabbed your attention right away. I remember seeing these guys, like I said, never heard of them, just come out of nowhere, and I was instantly hooked. And they're going to just dominate all the way through the Empire albums. Jeff Tate's voice, legendary. This is an unbelievable band. They're our third nominee. Queensryche with their EP. They are so good, folks, that I gave them a nominee, even though they don't have a full album out, just an EP. But this EP, I would say, off the top of my head, the greatest heavy metal EP at that time. EPs were pretty rare, right? We've seen a few this year. A lot of EPs didn't go anywhere. This thing, not only is it rare to see bands put out EPs, but it's even more rare for that EP to garner this much attention. The whole world saw Queensryche and went, whoa, this band's going to be huge. Again, our third nominee, Queensryche. But our fourth band is one of my favorite bands in the entire spectrum of heavy metal. Sabotage puts out their debut album, Sirens. I cannot tell you how much I love Sabotage and how much I love early Sabotage. Really good stuff here. If you're familiar with later day Sabotage, they really move into a very progressive style. Here, they're much more straightforward heavy metal, power metal. The Oliva brothers are still in the band. Chris on guitars, John on vocals. John had some personal issues and had to step away from the band, off and on. Of course, Chris Oliva tragically dies because of some asshole drunk driver. Let me tell you, this band is so talented. And if they would have had the proper record support, I think they would have been huge. If they would have got the same love that, say, like Queensryche was getting from their label, I think they would have gone on to be one of the biggest bands of all time. I mean, they end up being a pretty big band. We'll talk about them a lot through the 80s. Don't want to get too carried away here. But our fourth nominee, don't sleep on Sabotage and their album, Sirens. Some pretty big bands. There's still one more. Our fifth and final nominee, you know it, Slayer, with their first album, Show No Mercy. Two of the big four thrash metal bands come out in 1983. It's kind of amazing when I was sitting here talking about all these great American bands. And here we have Metallica, Slayer, Queensryche, Sabotage, just in this mix alone. And let's face it, Dio, while there's members of people from different countries in that band, Ronnie James Dio, of course, is also from New York. So you could technically call that an American band too. Where did all these great American bands come from? And it's kind of interesting because we just got through talking about the hard rock category. When you see this explosion of American metal, it's kind of like a fork. It's got three prongs to it. You got that traditional heavy metal, Queensryche, Sabotage. You've got the beginning of the thrash metal movement, one of the most important movements in the history of heavy metal. You have two of the big four right here with Slayer and Metallica. And you also have more of the glam big hair movement in California, where we just got through talking about two of the biggies there, Dokken and Rat. Here you go, folks. That's how many great bands that were coming out in 1983, that you kind of have three genres being formed right in front of your eyes. It's incredible. And Slayer has such a huge influence over the entirety of heavy metal. Now, one of the things I do on this channel is I talk about bands I like. I don't talk about bands I don't like. If I don't talk about a band, you can assume that either I never heard of them, and that's possible, or I just don't really care for them and I'm just going to move on. But sometimes bands are too big to ignore, and people are like, wait a minute, did you hit your head? How do you miss this band? So let me just get this out of the way. You can take away my metal card. You can, give me the business. I don't really like Slayer, and I'll tell you why. Slayer song comes on, I'm like, yeah, this is going to be great. Oh, this is a good song. Why don't I listen to Slayer more? And then they start singing. And I just turn it off. There's just certain singers out there, folks, that just don't do it for me. However, I cannot, in good conscience, leave them off for Best Newcomer of the Year, because again, they are going to turn around and become one of the biggest bands on planet Earth. All five of these bands are going to have huge commercial success. What a crop. And the winner is? I love Sabotage. I love Queensryche. But this really comes down to two bands, Metallica and Dio. What to do? Well, when in doubt, cheat. So I'm going to do the same thing I did with Ozzy and Iron Maiden. Newcomer of the Year, Metallica. Comeback of the Year, Dio. Listen, there's not too many people in this world that get a third chance, right? Dio is fired from Rainbow. Dio is fired from Sabbath. And to come back with an album this strong, unbelievable. And Metallica, we talk about the big four all the time, but Metallica blows everybody away, at least from a commercial standpoint. You can't argue that Metallica is the biggest band on planet Earth, still this day, 2025. In fact, it's ironic that Metallica does not go on to huge success for, almost a decade after this. They put out some of the greatest albums in history pretty much as an underground band until they put out the video for one, and then of course they had the huge hit with the Black Album, and then all bets were off. But up until then, they were not a commercially successful band. It is funny. Don't let people, rewrite history. Metallica started off very low key, but oh my word, the minute you heard them, you went, wait a minute, what is this? This is incredible. I love Kill 'Em All. I'm going to talk about it more in another episode, but just know every song on this album is perfect. It is raw. It has so much energy. It will flat tear you up. Metallica, Dio, congratulations on winning Heavy Metal Newcomers and Comebacks of the Year. But who did the Grammys pick that year? Once again, the Grammys picked one of the most popular bands of their time, but a band that hasn't lived on in the way like Metallica has, still selling out arenas all over the world. But an interesting selection nonetheless. The Grammys that year, for their Newcomer of the Year, picked Culture Club, Boy George and the crew. Now listen, in my humble opinion, there is no comparison to Metallica and Dio as far as the legacy they have in music to Culture Club. However, I gotta say that while Boy George dressed in like this ridiculous onesie and had baubles on his hats, and they could write a catchy tune. To this day, out of randomness, I'll get that stupid song, Come a Chameleon, stuck in my head. Why? You know, there was a kid's show a long time ago called Inside Out, where all the emotions of this little girl are fighting to get her through puberty or whatever the hell they were doing. And one of the funny skits in there is, at one point, they put in this jingle, this commercial jingle out of her memory banks to play it. Whenever she's sad or whatever, they put this jingle in that's stuck in her brain forever. Culture Club songs will get stuck in your brain, and you can never get rid of them. It's fact. However, Culture Club, in just a few short years, while they had some huge hits in their day, again, never really changed, stayed with the music for years. Probably many of you on this who are listening to this are going, Culture Club, never heard of them. But I know who Metallica is, and I know who Ronnie James Dio is, and I know who Queensryche is. So, again, not only should Metallica win Best Newcomer of the Year for heavy metal, they really should win it for Best Newcomer of the Year across the board. Congratulations to Metallica. Congratulations to Dio. But hey, I'll give a conciliatory nod to Boy George. They could write a catchy tune. And that's our episode. As you can tell, 1983 is just bananas, all the great bands. Let me just say, you're going to hear a lot about Queensryche on this channel. They're going to go on a run. You're going to hear a lot about Dokken. You're going to hear a lot about Rat. You're going to hear a lot about Sabotage, Metallica, Dio. These are some of my favorite bands of all time. But the only way you're going to hear it is if you subscribe to the channel, so you get recommendations and alerts to say, hey, the Metal Dude's going to be talking about Metallica. I think in the next couple of weeks, we're going to be talking about that Kill 'Em All album in great detail, as I'm sure it's going to be up for a lot of awards. Dio's Holy Diver, again, I think the best album that Dio ever did in his solo career. One of the best albums of all time. We're going to be talking about that. And again, we're going to be talking about some legendary bands that are going to explode onto the scene. And keep in mind, we still have all the new wave of British heavy metal now hitting their peak too, with like people like Maiden and Saxon, etc. So, you want to watch these next episodes, you want to get alerted, put a thumbs up. Subscribe to the channel. We are a small channel, but we are mighty. We are growing. About a year and a half in, and thank you all who have subscribed. Thank you all for clicking and giving me thumbs up. It means a lot. You know what means the most to me, though? Hearing from you in the comments. I know we live in a culture where there's a lot of hostility on the internet. Don't let people stop you from talking about heavy metal. Come in, drop a chat. Tell me who your favorite bands are. Tell me who you think should have won Rookie of the Year. I think it's pretty obvious, but you might have some differing viewpoints on that. So make sure to put comments down below as well. I read and try to respond to all of them. So 1983, another great year of metal. We'll get into it the next few weeks, but in the meantime, this is the Metal Dude signing off. Take care.